you have to be focusing on right now. Tayson is literally in a world of hurt, but at the same time finds 2. That could be the difference. It'll have to be Vino going for the win right now in order to catch up. He's going for Erkin as well. If he gets 3, that could be it. He's moving forward, forcing the placement. Tayson on all walls, but he sees everything through. Finds it. A big matchup. Tayson takes them all.
Tayson is now a 3 times FNCS champion, winning the solo FNCS in Season 3, the trio FNCS in Season 4, and now the solo All-Stars Showdown Championship at the start of this season, Season 7. But how did he get here, and what makes him so good? From some of the earliest tournaments recorded in Fortnite, Tayson has been performing extremely well. Looking back at his World Cup placements, there was clearly some potential here, seeing as he made $1,625 in total. His best placement in this being 157th in Solos Week 7. This was early on into his competitive career, and obviously we know where this ends up, but it shows that there was a ton of potential even in his solos to start with. In Season X, this is when the first solo cash cups were introduced, and he performed extremely well in some of these. In 3 in a row, he placed 13th, 9th, and then 23rd. This season he didn't really perform too well overall in the trio's FNCS, but still managed to make it through and get some money for himself somewhere. The next season he continued a really good streak on the solo cash cups, but this time made heats in squad FNCS, teaming up with Lou, who you should know from Wave, as he's the head of esports there. They ended up placing 7th, which was definitely respectable, but not managing to make it through to the finals. Over the last 3 seasons, there was a clear, steady increase in Tayson's placements, and it was about time that he did something big. The next season, in Chapter 2, Season 2, that exactly happened. He started teaming up with Janice, and in the first Duo Cup, which was the FNCS Warm-Up Cup, they actually ended up placing 1st. This is where I first heard of both of these players. Remember watching both of them win this tournament and being extremely impressed with their gameplay, and interested to see who the newcomers were on the scene. Throughout the weeks, they performed extremely well, and at their heat, they actually ended up winning their heat too. However, when it came to the finals, they unfortunately flopped and ended up placing 33rd out of the 50 teams. This was definitely an insight into both of these players, who we know will go on to win FNCSs down in the future. That wasn't the only FNCS this season, as there was also the FNCS Invitational as well. Finally, another stacked tournament for Tayson to prove himself, and he actually ended up placing 5th overall. I feel like this placement is often forgotten since Janice ended up coming 1st, but 5th is incredibly good. Moving over to Chapter 2 Season 3, where yet again we had another season of solos. Benji was absolutely dominant in the qualifiers for this, but unfortunately fizzled out towards the end. But Tayson had the match to light that flame yet again, and he ended up winning his heat and also the finals, claiming his first FNCS title. Now if you look back at his placements, again, this was a clear and steady rise from a guy who had potential back in the World Cup time to a guy who was finally at his peak and able to perform. But the next season offered a difficult challenge because this was a team mode, and this is something that so far in a finals Tayson hadn't been able to prove himself in yet. For the trio season in Chapter 2 Season 4, he didn't end up teaming up with Janice at all, but he ended up going with Mongrel and Mitro, which I'm sure we all remember how that ended up going down. This team was an incredibly scary and hyper-aggressive team who you would not want to get in the way of. Their fighting capabilities and raw levels of aggression made them an absolutely unstoppable force. With Stark dominated, Tayson's incredible IGLing capabilities, they won yet again another FNCS title. However, this team didn't necessarily work out too well for Tayson overall, because there was a lot of chemistry issues between them, so they eventually split. Tayson struggled with a lot with finding teammates, getting new teammates, dropping teammates, but eventually for Chapter 2 Season 5 ended up sticking with iDrop and Savage. There was a huge potential for this team to perform extremely well, and during the qualifier weeks, they kind of messed around a lot but still showed that they could perform extremely well. When it came to finals, they ended up placing 8th. Tayson has said that there was obviously a ton of pressure on him for winning the last 2 FNCSs in a row, so trying to get the 3 in a row, obviously there was a ton of expectations. 8th is a very good placement, but I don't think for him he would be overall excited about that, given he'd just won the last 2 and was looking for 3 in a row. But yet again, this team didn't seem to work out for chemistry issues. So moving on to Chapter 2 Season 6, and we saw an unexpected team change of Nate and ForZR teaming up with him. This was surprising because Nate, ForZR and Kizix were a really good team together, however they just hadn't put it all together due to a number of, quite honestly, outside circumstances. They'd been some of the best teams over the last 2 seasons, so to see them split and to pick up Tayson instead of Kha'Zix was a surprise. These guys put on a performance when it came to the Cash Cups and Cash Cup extras and set a real high expectation for what level of team this could be. Me personally, I was extremely excited for these guys because I was a big fan of Nate Forziar and Kha'Zix, and adding Tayson to that mix instead of Kha'Zix was a recipe for success. However, when it came to the qualifiers, they very much so underperformed. They struggled a lot during the qualifying weeks. However, when it came to their heat, they finally turned it on. They managed to place first in their heat and show that they'd fixed all of the issues, in particular Storm Surge issues, and were able to dominate. When it came to the finals, these guys ended up placing third, which again was a massive, massive placement. Not a first, but still an incredibly impressive one. Not a first that I'm sure Tayson was wanting, but something he should definitely be proud of. So with 2 FNCSs out of the way this year, both of them being trios, the next up was the FNCS All-Star Showdown. Game 1 loads in and he drops into the Orchard, his drop spot for the remainder of the games. He was completely uncontested for all 6 of these matches and decided to land on the south hand building, loot the chest on the roof, then drop down and grab as much metal as possible, looting this building and then grabbing more metal as he went, a total of 250 metal before even moving north. He would then loot main, the red barn, the northeast side chests, the main house, and then the single chest to the southwest side, then disengaging. He disengaged relatively early in his matches, on average 30 seconds before the first zone started closing. He had a multitude of options to do with his Storm Surge strategy, which usually consisted of just getting at least 2 to 3 layers off of the ground so he had better vision wherever it was. Given the zone, he always had a different place to go. The first game he went to Zate Hill, but unfortunately got keyed by a Vertex, which ended up making him lose out on the first game. The next game he went to a bridge just south of that instead, which he chose to do 2 different games. He also went near Zate Hill again with the Zate Hill Rock and decided to go up on top of Corny to get more tags here in a different match. Across the 6 games he found a total of 4 launch pads in his inventory and only 8 peppers as well, so he did get good pad luck, but not necessarily pepper RNG either. A lot of people say solos are very zone RNG, but after being eliminated in the first game, in his second game he was set up in a relatively good spot, but pulled a max distance 3rd, 4th and 5th zones, and managed to rotate all of these by white lining them, choosing a good time to do so, and still had over 100 builds left. He did this purely by always making sure he was able to build up on top of some materials that were sitting there, which was a trend through all of his games. If there was a large rock, he would always break this down and harvest on top of it and build up in brick. If he found an area that was in wood, he would always build himself in wood to make sure he could re-harvest this. This was a consistent strat that he saw, and most of his rotations were just white lined, but because he was able to consistently refresh his materials, he was completely fine. In first moving of this game, he ended up using his launch pad. Most people would think to get as far ahead as possible, but Tayson actually decided not to go as fully forward as he can and decided to pull back a little bit. This is so he could sit and look and take some shots and assess where to go. He knew there was a player on his lair next to him, so he let him tunnel in and then attempted to break in behind him and use his tarp instead, which would have given him a nice refresh if he was able to pick up this elimination, which unfortunately he wasn't. Since this didn't work, he was extremely material efficient on his rotate. If you watch any of his endgame rotates, there are almost 0 builds that don't have any purpose to be placed, and he uses as little as possible, but yet still covers every angle that he needs to. With this consistent strategy of getting ahead, shooting back, he always is able to ensure he knows which layers are free because a lot of these players have already rotated. His strategy is very, very clear. Get ahead, spray and let some of these players catch up, then assess which layer is free, make a layer change, and then make a relatively free rotate. In this game in particular, he did this and noticed that height was free because Benji was too busy spraying someone else, and he was easily able to just use minimal materials to grab height, which eventually won him this game. I feel like this was a key importance to his gameplay generally. Get ahead, look for shots and eliminations if you can, let the zone catch up a little bit but don't get stuck in the back of the zone, assess the layers, find a free layer, and repeat. Game number 3, where he placed second after just placing first, wasn't as interesting of a game because most of the zones ended up pulling back, so you couldn't see many of these same strategies appear, but eventually he just had no materials on low ground after doing a fantastic job of staying alive for a long time, and unfortunately Andalex on height dropped down and just hit the big pump shot to finish him up. Game 4's endgame is very interesting however. In this game he ended up placing 5th. This time he's got way less materials, so rather than changing layers to get away from players, he decides to stay on the same layer looking for eliminations. In solos, the majority of your eliminations will come from players on your same layer, so if you need eliminations, changing layers to get away from players probably isn't the play, which is exactly what Tayson did here. He was relatively unsuccessful in this, however he managed to stay alive until 5th, using every last angle that he could to slide around all of the builds that were possible there, which secured him a ton more placement points. If he'd made a psycho play, he potentially would have gone out in 9th or 10th, but this managed to get him all the way up to 5th and gain those crucial placement points. After game number 4, the leaderboard shaped up in a very interesting way. Tayson was first with 90 points, however Vino was also behind him in second with also 90 points. Remember, 2 games remaining. Thomas HD, Kinzel and Nebs were still very close, and within these 2 games, if the top 2 choked, they could be able to catch up. Game number 5, exactly that happened. Tayson ended up getting sniped, gaining minimal points, and Vino ended up going down at the start of first moving zone. So going into game number 5, Vino was on 95 points, Tayson was on 92 points, and Kinzel was on 80 with Tripper on 78 right behind him. This was anyone's championship to play for. The game loaded up, and still no one decided to contest Tayson at his drop spot. Vino also managed to make it off spawn. There was a few close calls all the way through the match. However, both players were still alive in the moving zones. Multiple opportunities for Vino and Tayson to be picked up, including a moment where Toos manages to get into Tayson's box and luckily misses many shots. Tayson still manages to pick up more eliminations as he goes on, but is running very low on materials, and Vino is on height.
You have to be focusing on right now. Tayson is literally in a world of hurt, but at the same time finds 2. That could be the difference. It'll have to be Vino going for the win right now in order to catch up. He's going for Erkin as well. If he gets 3, that could be it. He's moving forward, forcing the placement. Tayson on all walls, but he sees everything through. Finds it. A big matchup. Tayson takes them all.
This ended in a 1v1 between who was going to be the champion and who was going to be the runner-up. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot. Peace.